Hello, good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University, Aligarh. Now, this is my third video on the topic that is minimal state, and today I'm going to talk about individualistic perspective of minimal state. Now, individualism and how individualism considers a state, the concept of state as a kind which is hindering its own growth. So, individualism developed as a protest movement against the hegemonic power of the state. So, individualism as social and political theory is based on the ultimate value of human personality. So, liberty, according to the exponents of individualism, is the highest human value. Hence, individualism stands for maximum amount of individual initiative and freedom. And there is an inverse relationship between individual freedom and state control. So, any extension of activity of state beyond some minimum limits will result in shrinkage of the liberty of individuals. So, individualists, in their quest for freedom, are impatient of state control and they decry all possible activities of the state. So, state has only negative utility, that is what they believe, and its only function is to protect public order and security. Hence, the individualistic and their supporters, they assign to the state only protective and no regulative function. So, individualistic standpoint has been summed up by Gardner when he says that state exists merely because crime exists, and its principal function, therefore, is to protect and restrain, not to foster or promote. So, the individualists and the supporters thus do not endow state with any positive content or positive function. The state is not a welfare state according to them, it's a police organization. So, state must not, argue the individualist, participate in culture, economic or other welfare activities, because that would amount to an infringement of individual initiative and liberty. So, state is simply a policeman and its duty is neither more nor less than to prevent robbery, murder and enforce contract. So, individualistic perspective with the rise of individualism again emphasized having a state with its minimum barest function. So, development of individualism starting essentially as an economic doctrine of laissez-faire to assist in the expansion of capitalism. Individualism ultimately developed into a creed of abiding socio-political values. Now, physiocrats were those who worked out their ideas in France in the 18th century. They were the one who opposed interference in economic affairs. So, they may be considered as pioneers in the economic individualism. So, these physiocrats raised their battle cry of non-interference against the mercantilist measure of the state, control of industry and commerce. They opposed intervention in the sphere of industry, as industry was not the source of wealth. And this physiocrats and their physiocratic theory of non-interference followed from their concept of the natural order, that is the rights to enjoy benefit of property, freedom of contract and right to have such freedom as was consistent with the freedom of others to follow their self-interest, which were considered as a basic ingredient of natural order. So, the natural order was an anticipation of utilitarianism. So, the main purpose of the teachings of physiocrats in 18th century, that is a group of French economists, was to assist in the removal of the obstacles that stood in the way of industrial capitalism. Now, this creed of non-intervention emerged in France, spread to different parts of Europe, and finally, it received a comprehensive treatment in the writings of Adam Smith, that is a celebrated English economist, starting from the premise that each man should be allowed to pursue his interest in his own way. Now, Adam Smith opposed all sorts of state interference with the normal process of industry and commerce. Now, Smith was a strong champion of laissez-faire, but the creed of individualism had to bid its time in the 19th century, and it was developed into a socio-political theory by John Stuart Mill and Herbert Spencer. Now, Mill and Spencer were the representatives of individualism in its class or traditional form. Now, this traditional trend can also be discovered in the writings of contemporary thinkers like Hayek, and under the challenge of economic crisis, unemployment, and mass misery, the traditional individualism had completely broken down. Now, we talk about the views of J.S. Mill, his individualistic perspective, and how it demanded a minimalist state. So, state as an instrument, it was devised by man for the promotion of the happiness of the community. Yet, he did not contemplate any wide scope of state activity, believing that men are moved to act solely by the desire for pleasure and the avoidance of pain. That is what Bentham said, and the utilitarian John Stuart Mill as well believed that each individual is the best judge of his own interest. So Mill came to the conclusion that main function of the state is to legislate, and the chief objective of legislation is to remove all institutional restraints on the free action of individuals. So individual himself is capable of exercising moral judgment, and the state cannot improve character of the people. So the state should restrict its sphere of activity to restraining individuals from indulging in such activities which affect their pursuance of the utility, that is the greatest happiness, adversely. So the punishment of offenders is another main function of the state, and the state should not interfere in the activities of law-abiding citizens who are the best judge of what is right and what is wrong, what is moral and what is immoral. So in this way, Mill also upheld the doctrine of individualism. And in this regard, he makes an eloquent vindication of freedom of thought and opinion. So he says every individual has an inalienable right to differ, that is, to be a non-conformist. So Mill insists that upon the value of human development in its richest way, and hence he makes an eloquent plea for largest possible free initiative for the individual. So freedom from interference by political authority or from tyranny of the mob rule is with Mill an article of faith, and he believed that no minority in a country where there is a pursuance of greatest good of the greatest number should be suppressed. So the government is not competent in silencing the opinion of those who had contrary views. So if all mankind minus one were of an opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing the mankind. So either way, whether an individual or whether the majority of people, they don't have any right over each other to silence each other from voicing their protest or their support for the cause. So the Mill defends not only the freedom of thought, but also the freedom of conduct. And here he advocates complete freedom of the individual in the sphere which does not concern the community. So community is justified in restricting only that activity of the individual which has social consequences. So Mill here makes, while expounding his theory, makes a distinction between self-regarding and other-regarding activities. Now, freedom of thought and freedom of conduct are the basic element of human happiness and the sure condition for advancement of mankind. So with these distinction, the self-regarding and other-regarding, here J.S. Mill very clearly categorizes what are the activities where state can interfere and what are there which it cannot. So he is, from individualistic perspective, he is talking about a state which needs to be minimalist in interfering in self-regarding activity, part of the individual liberty. If we move on to other individualistic writers and their views, we talk about Herbert Spencer as another one, and he starts from the idea of universal evolution. Now, Spencer postulates that the tendency of all things to ultimate equilibrium and the consequent tendency of all things to transform themselves by process of evolution in order to attain this equilibrium is universal. So, on this very principle, individual tends to equilibrate or find an equilibrium for himself with social environment by adaptation. So by inheritance of that adaptation until he attains a final or perfect equilibrium, the blessedness of final anarchy. Now, in this process of evolution, the state has a very limited role to play. I mean, this is the role that individual himself finds, because as per the nature, that equilibrium has to be achieved. So natural equilibrium should come in the social equilibrium. And individual, they have their own level of equilibrium, and with that, they try to match that of the social and find a perfect kind of a balance that can help them in surviving. So survival of the fittest, and the fittest will survive only when he achieves that equilibrium or that stability with the environment that it is born and brought up. So this is the process of evolution, and here he says the state has a very limited role to play. That is the function of protection, that is administration of law of equal freedom. Spencer treated the state as a joint stock protection company for mutual assurance. It should not assume any other function, nor otherwise interfere with the process of natural evolution. Now, Herbert Spencer, further he argues that the state should not undertake any public health nor give the poor any relief, because that would defeat the operation of law of natural selection and disturb the equilibrium. So the society that will be formed on the basis of interference in these aspects will not be a natural society, which is finding its equilibrium on the basis of the individual and social balance on their own capacities. So Spencer subscribes to the principle of struggle for existence and survival of the fittest as the guiding principle of social evolution. And he therefore argues from that point of view, saying that if family ethics were applied to state, it would retard the progress by giving the weakling more than he deserved and perpetuating undeserving life. Thus, Spencer stretches this concept of negative liberty on individual too far and to such an extent that he considered elimination of weak in the struggle for existence as a part of process of social progress, which is later on considered as reprehensible. And then further, if we talk about other views and the thinkers who talked about the minimal state from their own individualistic perspective, we have here F.A. Hayek. He says that he is also one of the traditional thinkers of logic. Not by chronology, he has tried to warm up the cold individualistic case for free enterprise and non-intervention by the political authority. Now he says state-sponsored economic planning, argues Hayek, is neither desirable, it's not practicable. So total planning is not practicable because even the best planner cannot comprehend the totality of human wants and desires. So that's a fruitless exercise and futile exercise. Not in partial planning is possible. So the undesirable reaction in the unplanned sector will adversely affect the working of the planned sector. So planning is also not desirable because administrators, to meet the changing needs of an advanced technology, will make arbitrary or discretionary rules which would amount to a travesty of the rule of law. So rule of law is the bedrock of democratic heritage, and this is what he emphasized. So economic planning of collectivist kind necessarily involves the very opposite of what they are trying to do. So hence governmental intervention through economic planning will reduce the democracy. That is what being tried everywhere, to a shadow without any substance. So the total planning is, it is true, neither practicable nor desirable. It may lead, as Hayek apprehended, to serfdom. But partial planning is both desirable and practicable. So on the basis of rich planning experience gathered through the decades, the fulfillment of effective partial plan, while avoiding the undesirable reactions with which it is associated, which Hayek argues, which are reactions which are associated, are in fact a possibility. So on the basis of rich planning experience, we have seen like how thoughts of our experience from decades have shown that the fulfillment of effective partial plans which has avoided the undesirable reactions and it has been possible and successful. So as a result of several centuries of lawmaking or planning, legislative abilities have considerably increased. So consequently, planning can be delimited exclusively to the fields that the people, through their legislative desires, try to implement. Now, views of Isiah Berlin is another who supported the individualistic perspective in the minimal state. He found the theory of welfare state to be inimical, that is harmful to human and individual liberty, and sought to revive the original concern of this tradition with laissez-faire philosophy. Now, their thought is an important component of contemporary liberal theory. Now, it is described as libertarianism. Now, in order to indicate this renewed concern with liberty and to distinguish it from the recent changes in the liberal outlook, he upheld the full autonomy and freedom of individual, and it seeks its liberation from all institutions which tend to restrict his views of the world, including the institution of religion or institution of family or customs of society, which are trying to form a conformity of a kind with political institutions. So philosophically, it repudiates the deterministic outlook of human life and maintains that the human personality, human character, and thought and actions cannot be construed as an outcome of his circumstances. In other words, it treats man as makers of his own destiny. It is therefore hostile to all social and legal restrictions on an individual's freedom of action. So in the political sphere, these libertarians and Isiah Berlin especially, he insists that man's economic activity must be actively liberated from all constraints to enable him to achieve true progress and prosperity. Now, drawing inspiration from the natural rights theory of John Locke, Berlin holds that certain rights of the individual which precede his political life are indefensible, and these cannot be surrendered in the favor of collectivity. It particularly defends the right to acquire and hold property and freedom of contract. Now, these rights are by no means the product of the state itself, hence the state cannot be allowed to intervene for any artificial balancing of rights. It even condemns taxation of the rich for the benefit of the poor, and further he argues that taxation for welfare of certain sections of society involves the forced transfer of fruit of one man's labor to another, and which serves as disincentive to individuals. So, all in all, Isiah Berlin concedes that government may legitimately engage in police protection and enforcement of contracts for which civil as well as criminal courts might be established. In addition, it may undertake national defense, but nothing beyond these functions. Thus, he upheld at best a night watchman state, and the amount of taxation they hold should be restricted to serve their purpose only. So, talking about the nature and sphere of state in individualistic perspective, we find that the individualism as a social and political theory, it embodies an eloquent protest against the encroachment of political authority on the sphere of the individual's activities, and it makes a passionate plea for maximization of individual freedom, introduction of self-control to the narrowest possible limits. So, in case of a conflict between the state and the group, the individual alone will determine his pendulum of loyalty, that is where it's going to put its faith. So the state has no primacy in the matter of this loyalty. As Lasky observes, the only state to which I owe allegiance is the state in which I discover moral adequacy. So if the individual's church conflict with the state, he chooses, and he alone can choose where his allegiance should go. Then the state is acceptable only as an coordinating agency, capable of adjusting the conflicting claims of different groups. Like Hegelian, the modern individualists do not assign a predetermined primacy or a sacrosanct character to the decision of political authority. So the justifications that they give is, firstly, it is argued that any extension of the control of state beyond a necessary limit would result in frustration of ethical development of man, and the state functions through law, which are uniformist in their nature, but individual personality is necessarily unique, and such uniqueness is sure to be destroyed by the standardization of values which state laws entail. So Mill's excuse me, the Mill's plea for non-interference by the state rests upon his emphasis upon the value of variety as a sure condition of the progress of human mind. As he observed in his essay on liberty, saying that such are the differences among human beings in their source of pleasure and their susceptibilities of pain and the operation on them of different physical and moral agencies, that unless there is a corresponding diversity in their modes of life, neither they obtain their fair share of happiness nor grow up to the mental, moral, or aesthetic stature of which they are capable. Then, secondly, we talk the justification in the form of the biologists. They argue that as the individual qualities are biologically fixed, that is hereditary, so an individual should be left alone to work out his destiny without any help or guidance from the state. Now, Spencer's law of organic evolution here suggests the ceaseless struggle for existence through which men best fitted to grapple successfully with the surroundings would only survive and unfit would be eliminated. So state intervention would only disturb the process of natural selection. Then further, they say, like, free competition increases production, ensures efficiency, and maximizes economic welfare. So the self-interest of the consumer impels him to demand only those goods which are socially useful, whereas the self-interest of producer encourages him to produce at the least cost. So firms under the pressure of free competition, they tend to grow into optimum units, and the high-cost, inefficient firms are eliminated in the process. Thus, the cost declines and so do the prices. So total welfare is thus promoted. Then further on, they say the extension of state control over diverse field of society. This will render the state apparatus overburdened, and in consequence, its efficiency will suffer. So every additional function, observes J.S. Mill, means a new burden imposed on a body already overcharged with duties. The results is that most things are ill done and much is not done at all, because the government is not capable to do without delay. So these are the justifications and conclusion finally that we find in individualistic perspective of minimal state. And further, they say that any large-scale state control inevitably results in bureaucratic rule. So the legislature, as it is already a bulky body without any technical background, it is not competent to comprehend the complex nature of state operation, nor can it legislate in all technical details. So the result is that the power passes into the hands of executive. But the political executive, because of his lack of technical knowledge and preoccupation with the parliamentary and social activities, he has to rely heavily on the officials, that is the bureaucrats, for real conduct of government. And inevitably, real power rests with them, and this results in what Lord Herbert would say, the new despotism. So what you find in the individualistic perspective is that they are trying to limit the state in interfering in individuals' life from various perspectives and various stands, and the final word that comes from the minimalist state, whether it was in the 17th century at the time of Adam Smith or later on in 20th century when Nozick is talking about, or Friedman is talking about, a minimal state, it is to give the state those roles where it does not hinder the fullest development of individual and realizing all his potentialities in true form. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation, and thank you all for watching. Thank you.